Hey there, sleepless rabble. Tonight we're diving into one of the most absurd true crime stories ever told. It takes us straight to Paris, a city that means a lot to us because we lived there for many years. But this isn't the Paris of romance or fairy lights. This is the story of a man who killed, ate, and somehow got away with it. Twice. And instead of being locked up forever, he turned his crime into fame. If you enjoy what we do, hit like, subscribe, or support us over at ko-fi.com/napmax and tell us in the comments, which story do you want to hear next? This is Napmax Sleep Stories, and you're listening to The Cannibal of Paris, the man who ate and became famous. Let's begin. Paris, the city of love. The place where every tourist believes their relationship will magically transform into an Instagram fairy tale, complete with croissants, accordion music, and the Eiffel Tower sparkling like a disco ball for hopeless romantics. You can almost hear Edith Piaf in the background, crooning away while couples kiss dramatically on the Pont Neuf. Yes, Paris sells itself as the world's most romantic stage. Except, not in this story. Because while postcards showed candlelight dinners and boat rides on the Seine, the Bois de Boulogne was about to provide a very different picture. The park was alive with the usual summer soundtrack. Children squealing, couples feeding each other strawberries, the occasional jogger pounding past in neon shorts. Everything perfectly ordinary. Until he appeared. A small Japanese man, no taller than a teenager, dragging not one but two enormous suitcases behind him. His frame was so frail, it looked like the bags might crush him at any moment. Each step was a struggle, gravel crunching under the weight, his shirt already clinging to him with sweat. Onlookers frowned. The sight didn't add up. Tourists carried cameras, baguettes, bottles of cheap Bordeaux. Students lugged books, perhaps guitars. Nobody dragged luggage into the park as if preparing for a camping trip at the water's edge. He paused near the lake, catching his breath, glancing around in short, sharp bursts. To anyone watching, it was the picture of nerves. A man desperate to disappear what he had carried. But subtlety was not his strong suit. A young couple nearby had been watching the whole performance. At first with amusement, he looked ridiculous, almost slapstick, dwarfed by his own baggage, then with unease. What exactly was he doing? Finally they called across, asking plainly if the suitcases were his. In that instant, he cracked. No excuses, no attempt to bluff. He simply abandoned everything and ran. His tiny figure darted down the path and melted into the trees, leaving the bags behind like props in a grim theatre. The couple exchanged looks. Against their better judgment, curiosity pulled them forward. They approached the luggage, hesitated, then unzipped one case. Inside lay horror. Severed limbs, flesh, blood, fragments of a young woman stuffed into the fabric like some butcher's delivery. The stench hit them. The sight froze them, and the idyllic summer evening shattered in an instant. The police were called. Sirens cut through the calm. Families packed up picnic baskets and left, glancing back in confusion and fear. Uniformed officers swarmed the area, cordoning off the lakeside, lifting the cases as if they carried radioactive waste. The peaceful Bois de Boulogne had transformed into the set of a crime scene. In Paris, a city that thrived on beauty, spectacle, and performance, this was something grotesquely different. The city of love now had two suitcases full of human remains, and a mystery man who had vanished into the dusk. His name wasn't known yet. His history wasn't known. What he had done beyond the obvious, not yet revealed. But those abandoned bags had already marked the beginning of a case so strange, so repulsive, that it would eclipse the cliches of Paris forever. When the police unzipped those suitcases in the Bois de Boulogne, Paris stopped being the city of love and became, for one hot June evening in 1981, the city of dismembered nightmares. The contents were obvious. A woman, cut apart, carefully packed. Whoever had done this hadn't acted in blind rage. There was method in the madness. Step one for the investigators was clear. Find the little man who had abandoned the bags. Witnesses had seen him, a Japanese student, small, frail, sweating as though the weight of the world and something else was dragging him down. The couple who confronted him described his panicked flight, and in the remains, there were clues that pointed straight toward the victim's circle. It didn't take long to put a name to the face. Issei Sagawa, a 32-year-old literature student at the Sorbonne. He was already known around campus for his odd, quiet presence, forever watching from the sidelines. The last person seen with the victim, Renee Hartvelt, was him. Detectives went to his small apartment in the 16th arrondissement. What they found there erased any lingering doubt. Bloodstains, utensils, photographs documenting his crime, and the kind of leftovers in the fridge that no one could stomach to look at for long. Sagawa didn't resist when they arrived. He didn't run, didn't argue. He was arrested quietly, almost meekly, as though he had been waiting for the knock at the door. In custody, he confessed immediately. Not reluctantly, not with excuses, but with a calmness that unnerved even seasoned investigators. Yes, he had shot Renee. Yes, he had dismembered her. And yes, he had eaten her flesh. Then came the statement that froze the room. It wasn't about killing. I never wanted to kill her. I only wanted to eat her. To the police, it was more grotesque than any denial. This wasn't a crime of passion, not a quarrel gone wrong. The murder had been a means to an end. The end being the consumption of human flesh. Killing was simply the practical step required to satisfy his obsession. Outside the interrogation room, the press went into frenzy. Le cannibale japonais de Paris. Headlines screamed about horror in the city of love, and readers couldn't look away. A story this bizarre wrote itself. The frail little foreigner with an appetite darker than anything Paris had ever imagined. For investigators, though, spectacle was secondary. They had their man. They had his confession. The question that remained was how it had all unfolded in that cramped Paris apartment. The final evening of Renee Hartvelt, who had walked into what she believed was a study session and never walked out again. Renee Hartvelt had no reason to be afraid. She was the kind of student who thrived in Paris, the kind of person others described as open, warm, and endlessly curious. Born in the Netherlands, she spoke multiple languages with ease, and her generosity with her time was almost instinctive. When her classmate Issei Sagawa asked her for a small favor, to come by his flat and record some passages in German for what he described as a study project, she agreed without hesitation. It was harmless, after all. He looked harmless. Sagawa's apartment in the 16th arrondissement was small and cluttered, the typical space of a foreign student. Stacks of books, papers scattered across the desk, an air of intellectual busyness. Renee entered, expecting nothing more than an evening of reading and perhaps a shared meal. To her, it was just another part of academic life in Paris, helping out a fellow student, giving her voice to a tape recorder. What she could not have known was that Sagawa had been waiting for this moment for years. From the outside, He appeared timid, fragile, almost childlike in stature. But inside, he carried fantasies so grotesque they defied comprehension. He was obsessed with tall, blonde, fair-skinned women, everything he himself was not. In his mind, consuming them was the only way to bridge the gap between his frailty and their vitality. That night, as Renee read aloud from the German text, her voice steady and melodic, he moved behind her. Hidden in the room was the weapon he had prepared, a small rifle, to Sagawa. The killing itself was never the point. He would tell police later with chilling calm, it wasn't about killing. I never wanted to kill her. I only wanted to eat her. The shot, in his mind, was nothing but a practical step. He raised the gun, aimed at the back of her head, and pulled the trigger. The crack of the shot silenced her voice, mid-sentence. Renee collapsed instantly. What followed was an act of horror that blurred the line between madness and ritual. First, Sagawa violated her body. Then, with deliberate movements, he began to cut into her flesh. He took photographs, documenting each stage as though building a grotesque archive. Where most would have recoiled in shock, he lingered with fascination. And then he began to eat. Over the next 48 hours, he consumed parts of her body. He later described the act not with remorse, but with a detached curiosity, even comparing flavors and textures as though recalling a culinary experiment. He ate until the smell of decomposition forced him to stop. Only then did his appetite give way to the practical problem of disposal. As the air in the small apartment grew sour with decay, Sagawa set about cutting what remained into pieces. He stuffed them into 2 cheap, ordinary suitcases, the same luggage he would later drag into the Bois de Boulogne. To him, it was simply logistics, the final step in a fantasy that had spiraled from thought into reality. For Renee, the story had ended the moment she accepted the invitation. She had come to help with a recording, to lend a voice to a friend's project. Instead, her trust was betrayed in the most brutal way possible, because hidden behind one student's small, unassuming frame was an obsession that turned kindness into tragedy and hospitality into horror. To understand the horror that would one day unfold in Paris, you have to go back, thousands of miles away, decades earlier, to a fragile child who entered the world already marked by weakness. Issei Sagawa was born in 1949 in post-war Japan, a country still raw from devastation, disease, and hunger. His arrival was premature, his body tiny and sickly. Doctors doubted he would survive. At the time, an epidemic of enteritis ravaged newborns, and Sagawa was among those infected. Though he pulled through, the illness left its mark. His nervous system never fully developed. From the start, he was different. He failed to grow as other children did. By the time he reached adulthood, he stood just 1.42 meters tall, a man trapped in the body of a stunted boy. His frame was delicate, his legs thin, his head disproportionately large. He looked fragile enough to be knocked over by a strong gust of wind. In Japan, where conformity and strength carried enormous cultural weight, his condition made him stand out in the worst way. In school photographs, he was always the smallest in the back row, the one who looked like he didn't belong. Among classmates, he was more curiosity than companion, tolerated at best, ridiculed at worst. He knew it. From an early age, shame settled into his bones. He saw himself as ugly, unworthy, grotesque. Where other boys imagined themselves becoming athletes or businessmen, Sagawa carried the constant awareness that he was physically less, and always would be. But fragility didn't erase desire. If anything, it sharpened it. His isolation gave his mind space to wander, and his fantasies soon grew darker than anyone could have guessed. He was drawn to women whose bodies seemed to mock his own. Tall, blonde, fair-skinned. They represented everything he lacked: health, vitality, presence. To him, they were goddesses, unattainable figures striding through a world where he was destined only to watch from below. Admiration curdled into hunger. Where another boy might have dreamed of holding a woman's hand, Sagawa dreamed of consuming her. Not metaphorically, literally. His imagination twisted desire into appetite. He pictured flesh between his teeth, strength flowing into his small body as though eating might correct what nature had denied him. These were thoughts no child could confess, no teenager could admit. So he kept them inside, secret, festering. Outwardly, he was the quiet son of a wealthy businessman, educated and protected. Inwardly, he was building a private world of fantasies so grotesque they would one day spill into reality. By the time he reached early adulthood, the pattern was set. He was fragile, ashamed, convinced of his ugliness, and he was obsessed with women who embodied everything he wasn't. He wanted not their love, not their attention, but their flesh. And though his family's wealth could shield him from humiliation, it could not cure the hunger growing inside. That hunger would travel with him, shaping every thought, every desire, until the day it finally found an outlet. As Issei Sagawa grew older, his body never caught up. By his 20s, he looked less like a man than a fragile child in an ill-fitting suit. Thin legs, oversized head, voice barely above a whisper. He was the kind of figure who disappeared in a crowd, unless people noticed him for the wrong reasons. He noticed himself constantly. Mirrors were his enemy, photographs his humiliation. He was, in his own words, ugly. Not the sort of self-deprecating ugly people toss around for sympathy, but ugly in the brutal, clinical sense. Too small, too weak, too odd to blend in. Every reflection was a reminder that he would never be the kind of man who turned heads in admiration. But that didn't stop him from looking. If anything, it made him stare harder. And what caught his eye, without fail, were women who stood at the opposite pole of his existence. Tall, blonde, pale-skinned. Women who seemed sculpted by some higher hand, walking embodiments of vitality and confidence. They were everything he wasn't, everything he could never be. For most men, such women might have been the stuff of infatuation, distant crushes, or romantic daydreams. For Sagawa, they became symbols, icons of strength, beauty, and life itself. And in his fractured logic, the only way to bridge the gap between himself and them was not love, not intimacy, but consumption. The fantasies were specific, and they were constant. He imagined biting into their flesh, tasting their skin, swallowing pieces of them until their strength flowed into him. He believed, in the twisted privacy of his mind, that eating them could correct what nature had denied him, that their beauty could erase his ugliness, their vitality could fill his frailty. It wasn't lust in any ordinary sense. It wasn't romance or even domination. It was hunger, raw, literal, unrelenting. Where another young man might have pictured a kiss, Sagawa pictured a meal. And the more he told himself it was impossible, the more he obsessed over it. Outwardly, he remained the quiet son of privilege. He studied. He read. He passed through the routines expected of him. To his wealthy family, he was still the delicate child who needed protection, not exposure. But inside, the fantasies grew unchecked. Every tall woman he passed in the street became another trigger, another reminder of his inadequacy, another spark to feed the hunger. He said later that the obsession was never casual, it was constant. From childhood into adulthood, the urge only deepened, becoming part of the fabric of who he was. It wasn't something he wanted to resist. It was, in his mind, inevitable. And so, by the mid-1970s, he was no longer just a fragile man with shameful thoughts. He was a predator in waiting. His fantasies had outgrown his imagination. They demanded reality. And in 1977, in Tokyo, he finally tried to cross that line. In that year, the fantasies had outgrown the privacy of Issei Sagawa's school. Tokyo was loud, fast, indifferent, the perfect city to hide a quiet plan in plain sight. He did what had worked so well in his head. He put on the harmless mask. The fragile, polite man with careful manners and a soft voice. A student, of course, and like all students, he had a perfectly reasonable request. He invited a German student to his apartment. Language practice, he said. Reading. Maybe a recording. It sounded academic, practical, safe. She agreed. Because why wouldn't she? He looked like someone you'd help carry groceries, not someone you'd fear in a locked room. Inside, the performance continued. Books, papers, the ritual of innocence. Then the mask slipped. He attacked. Not with passion, not with rage, with a butcher's intent. His focus wasn't death, it was flesh. Specifically flesh from her buttocks. The same grotesque fixation he would later enact in Paris. He tried to cut a piece from a living woman as if a human being were a sample tray. Reality, however, refused to cooperate with fantasy. She fought. Panic cut through the room like a siren. He was small, weak, clumsy. She was terrified, but very much alive. She escaped. The neighbors heard. The police arrived. The script, the one he'd rehearsed for years, fell apart in seconds. Sagawa was arrested. Suddenly the private hunger had a case number. And then Tokyo did what powerful cities often do when respectable families are involved. It smoothed the edges. His father, a well-connected, wealthy businessman, stepped forward. Lawyers appeared. Apologies were made. Compensation was arranged. The story that should have thundered across headlines thinned into paperwork and polite silence. The attack wasn't reimagined as a misunderstanding. It was minimized as an incident. The system didn't treat him like a predator who had tried to cut meat from a living woman. It treated him like a problem to be managed. A delicate son. An unfortunate episode. Something that could be corrected with money, influence, and the right phone calls. There should have been a reckoning, jail, treatment, at the very least a wall of consequences to keep the public safe. Instead, there was a quiet exit strategy. Tokyo, it seemed, was not the best environment for his health. Education abroad would be good for him. Distance would be good for everyone. And just like that, the man who had already tried to act on cannibalistic fantasies was nudged off the stage and pointed toward Europe. He did not leave cured. He left unpunished and emboldened. The lesson he learned wasn't that his desire was monstrous. It was that monsters with the right connections don't have to fear the dark. They can fly business class. On paper, he was headed to France to study literature. In truth, he was carrying the same appetite onto a different continent. The crime had failed in Tokyo, not because he doubted himself, but because his body couldn't keep up with his plan. And because his victim fought like a person who wanted to live. And so the hunger boarded a plane. He would land in a city that sold beauty by the postcard and privacy by the tiny apartment. a place where a soft-spoken stranger could be invisible in lecture halls and anonymous in crowds, a place with tall, fair women everywhere and nobody who knew what he'd already tried to do. Tokyo had given him a warning shot. It had also given him a pass. He left Tokyo not as a man reformed, but as a man untouched. The attack was buried under money, the shame pushed onto silence. What remained was the same frail body, the same grotesque fantasies, only now armed with the knowledge that consequences could be avoided. And so, with his family's blessing and society's blind eye, Issei Sagawa was sent abroad. To study, officially. To disappear, unofficially. The new destination was France, a city where no one knew his past, where anonymity was effortless, where the stage was set for obsessions to grow unchecked. When Issei Sagawa arrived in Paris, it was under the guise of scholarship. On paper, he was a literature student at the Sorbonne, immersed in French culture, writing, and the intellectual playground of Europe's most glamorous city. In reality, he was a man exported like contraband, fragile, dangerous, and unpunished. Paris in the late 1970s was a dream for outsiders. It had cafés filled with cigarette smoke and politics, bars where poets and frauds blurred together, boulevards that seemed like catwalks for the effortlessly beautiful. For someone who had grown up in the rigid social structures of Japan, it should have been a fresh start. But Sagawa didn't arrive as a blank page. He carried every ounce of shame, obsession, and hunger with him. At the Sorbonne, he blended into the margins. Not because he fit in, but because he didn't. The small, timid Japanese student with the high voice was barely noticed in classrooms, buzzing with louder personalities. He was a ghost at lectures, a quiet presence whose name most classmates probably forgot. That invisibility was a kind of gift. No one knew he had already tried to act on fantasies so grotesque they defied language. No one asked why he always watched but rarely spoke. And still, the same obsession shadowed him everywhere. Paris was saturated with the very image that tormented him. Tall, blonde, fair-skinned women, in cafes, on the metro, in lecture halls. They were everywhere, moving freely, unaware of the eyes tracking them from below. To Sagawa, they weren't people. They were symbols. Living embodiments of everything he lacked. And the longer he spent in Paris, the more the line between desire and hunger blurred. By day, he shuffled between lectures, his notebooks as neat as any other student's. By night, his fantasies played on repeat. He filled notebooks with dark imaginings, wrote about flesh and desire in ways that looked like theory, but were closer to confession. His apartment became both library and laboratory, a place where literature sat side by side with knives, where intellectual exercises disguised rehearsals for obsession. He tried to feed himself with culture, French novels, German philosophy, poetry recited in voices not his own. But none of it satisfied. The hunger was always there, gnawing beneath the surface. When he looked at women in Paris, he didn't see fellow students or strangers on the street. He saw future meals. And perhaps the most tragic part was how unthreatening he appeared. His stature, his meekness, his childlike mannerisms all combined to make him seem incapable of harm. He was the sort of man people dismissed without thought. Too small, too fragile, too odd, invisible. And invisibility for him was perfect cover. It was in this anonymity that he found her. A fellow student, generous with her time, patient with his halting manner. Her name was Renée Artefelt, and to Sagawa, she was the embodiment of everything he had spent his life hungering for. This young woman was 25, Dutch, and everything Issei Sagawa's obsession demanded. Tall, blonde, pale-skinned, the ideal he had been carrying in his head since boyhood. She was also intelligent, gifted with languages, and generous with her time. To classmates, she was approachable, someone who helped without hesitation. To Sagawa, she was a living target, wrapped in kindness. He met her at the Sorbonne, where his timid presence barely registered among the crowds. She, however, noticed him enough to be polite, even patient. That small act of attention was all he needed. For him, it wasn't friendship, it was opportunity. He began to ask favors. Small at first, nothing alarming. Help with study, with translation, with reading. She agreed, the way kind people often do, not knowing she was stepping into the role he had already cast for her in his fantasies. By the spring of 1981, his plan was set. He told her he needed a German recording for a project. Just a short session in his apartment, nothing unusual for a student. She accepted, unaware she had already become the centerpiece of a script he had been rehearsing for years. Renée Hartvelt never saw herself as exceptional. She was bright, yes, multilingual and ambitious, but her life in Paris was not a headline. It was a student's life, full of lectures, essays, and evenings of conversation with friends. She carried herself with the ease of someone who believed the world was wide open. And for her, Paris was proof of that. A city where her future could take shape. Her family in the Netherlands knew her as generous and determined, the kind of daughter who gave her time freely, but also chased her own path with conviction. She wrote, she phoned, she sent back pieces of her Parisian life. There was pride in her words, never fear. When the call came, the world split in two. Not accident, not illness. Something far beyond comprehension. Their daughter, their sister, had been murdered. Not only murdered, but mutilated, violated, consumed. The details were too monstrous to believe. How could such words even belong to her name? The shock did not remain private for long. Headlines erupted across Europe. Cannibale japonais à Paris. The Dutch press covered every development, dissecting the crime with a mix of outrage and morbid fascination. The French papers lingered on the absurdity of it all. A city known for romance turned into a theatre of horror. And through every column and headline, Renée's identity was forced into the role of the victim, her life reduced to the cruelty of her death. For her family, grief became a public spectacle. Strangers discussed her daughter's body, her daughter's fate. Her name circulated not as a promise for the future, but as a synonym for tragedy. And beneath the frenzy, the question of justice pressed forward. The police had their man. He had confessed without hesitation. The evidence was overwhelming. For Renée's loved ones, the path ahead seemed painfully clear. A trial, a conviction, some measure of balance. But in France, nothing about this case was ever going to be straightforward. The stage was set for the legal system to decide what came next. In most murder cases, the script is simple. There is an arrest, an investigation, and then a trial. The accused stands before a judge, evidence is laid bare, and a verdict is delivered. It doesn't bring the victim back, but it offers the family something to cling to. Justice, or at least the appearance of it. But from the very beginning, the case of Issei Sagawa refused to follow that script. The evidence was overwhelming. He had confessed in chilling detail. The photographs, the remains in his refrigerator, the suitcases dragged into the Bois de Boulogne. There was no reasonable doubt left to resolve. The prosecution's job should have been easy. And yet, the courtroom never opened. Instead, Sagawa was examined by psychiatrists. They listened as he described his motives without shame, without hesitation. He told them the killing was never his goal, that all he had wanted was to eat, that the gunshot, the violation, the butchery, all of it was simply a practical step to reach his real objective, human flesh. The experts came back with a verdict of their own, not guilty by reason of insanity. In their view, this was not a man making choices like the rest of us. This was a man consumed by delusion, trapped in a mind broken beyond repair. He was unfit to stand trial. For René's family, the words landed like another death sentence. There would be no trial, no cross-examination, no chance to hear the man responsible forced to face what he had done. Instead, the state ordered his confinement to the Henri Collin Psychiatric Hospital in Villejuif, outside Paris. On paper, it was supposed to be permanent. Locked doors, constant supervision, treatment rather than punishment. Society would be protected, justice would be served through medicine rather than law. That was the theory. But theories are fragile things, especially when they collide with politics, bureaucracy, and international pressure. Behind the walls of Villejuif, Sagawa did not behave like a man tormented by madness. He was calm, polite, cooperative. His sickness was not in wild outbursts or incoherent speech, but in the unnerving clarity with which he explained what he had done, and why he would do it again if given the chance. The psychiatrists had declared him insane, but the more he spoke, the more it seemed like something else entirely. Not insanity, but obsession without remorse. For the French state, he was now less a criminal than a burden. A foreigner confined indefinitely, costing money, complicating diplomatic relations. And meanwhile, his father, the wealthy businessman who had once hushed things up in Tokyo, was moving quietly in the background. Letters were written, contacts activated, pressure applied. The result would change everything. What began as a confinement in France would end with an unexpected transfer. Not a transfer to prison, but to freedom. Because while René's family mourned and the French press raged, Japan was already preparing to bring its wayward son home. In theory, Henri Collin Psychiatric Hospital should have been Issei Sagawa's final address. Locked wards, clinical supervision, a place where the French state could tuck away a man too grotesque for trial. For René Harteveldt's family, it was a poor substitute for justice. But at least it was security. At least he was contained. But borders and bureaucracy have a way of bending the rules, especially when influence is applied. Sagawa's father, a wealthy businessman with the kind of connections that open doors in silence, began to work. Officially, the request was simple. His son should be returned to Japan. He was a Japanese citizen after all. Why should France bear the cost of his care? Wouldn't treatment be better, more culturally appropriate, back home? Behind those polite diplomatic phrases lay the reality. France was eager to offload him. He was a foreigner, a political embarrassment, a grotesque curiosity clogging their legal system. If Japan wanted him back, the French were hardly going to argue. And so, in 1984, just 3 years after his arrest, Issei Sagawa was quietly flown out of France. No trial, no sentence, no accountability. He left behind a family still grieving, a case still raw in the public imagination, and a justice system that had chosen to wash its hands rather than wrestle with its responsibility. When he landed in Tokyo, he was transferred not to a prison, but to Matsuzawa Hospital, a psychiatric institution. The expectation, at least on paper, was that he would remain confined just as he had in France. But Japan's psychiatrists reached a different conclusion. After their own round of examinations, they declared him sane. Disturbed, yes. Dangerous, certainly. But legally sane, and therefore not subject to indefinite psychiatric detention. The paradox was brutal. In France, he was too insane to be tried, so he was never convicted. In Japan, he was too sane to be confined, so he could not be held. The loophole snapped shut in his favor. Within a matter of months, the doors opened. He walked out of Matsuzawa Hospital a free man. No criminal record in Japan. No sentence hanging over his head. Legally, he was nothing more than a man who had once been arrested abroad and then released. For Renee's family, it was a second betrayal. Their daughter's killer, the man who had confessed in detail, who had described eating her flesh without hesitation, was not only unpunished, but free to live his life. The outrage in Europe was immediate, but outrage travels poorly across borders. In Japan, the case became less about Renee and more about the strange, unsettling figure of Issei Sagawa himself. He returned not as a criminal, but as a curiosity. And curiosity in the modern age has a way of turning into celebrity. When Issei Sagawa walked out of Matsuzawa Hospital, he should have slipped into obscurity, a frail, disgraced man hidden away by family wealth. Instead, he became something far stranger, a celebrity. Japan in the 1980s was a country intoxicated by media spectacle. The economy was booming, tabloids were ravenous, and television thrived on the bizarre. And what could be more bizarre than a man who had confessed to eating a woman in Paris and walked free? At first, he was treated as a grotesque curiosity. The Paris cannibal, the tiny man with the enormous crime. But Sagawa leaned into it. He didn't hide from the cameras. He courted them. He gave interviews with the same eerie calm he had shown in custody, describing the taste of human flesh as though reviewing a restaurant meal. He explained his obsession with tall, blonde women as if discussing art. The press couldn't look away. Soon he was publishing books. His first, In the Fog, was a thinly veiled account of the murder of Renee Hartevelt. It sold. Other titles followed, each mixing confession and provocation. Rather than recoil, Japanese publishers realized they had found a niche, horror wrapped in autobiography, scandal packaged as literature. Then came the television appearances. Talk shows, documentaries, panel discussions, Sagawa sitting politely in his chair, speaking in a soft voice, his words describing the unspeakable. He didn't rage or tremble. He smiled faintly, spoke carefully, and told the nation exactly how he had killed and eaten a woman. The dissonance fascinated audiences. He was too small, too weak, too polite to look dangerous, which only made his words more chilling. And he didn't stop there. He moved into the world of adult entertainment. He wrote about his fantasies, posed for photographs, even appeared in pornographic films. Producers marketed him as the cannibal celebrity, a living reminder that the line between infamy and fame can be terrifyingly thin. In Japan, he became a household name, not admired, but recognized, referenced, ridiculed. His story was consumed the same way people consume ghost tales and urban legends, except this one wasn't fiction. For Renee's family, it was unthinkable. The man who had destroyed their daughter's life was not just free, he was monetizing the crime. Each book sold, each TV appearance, each grotesque stunt was another layer of insult. In Europe, outrage flared. In Japan, curiosity persisted. Issei Sagawa, the fragile boy who had grown into a frail man, had finally achieved what he always wanted. People could no longer ignore him. He was visible, not because of beauty, not because of strength, but because he had eaten them. It was celebrity born of cannibalism, a mirror held up to a society willing to turn horror into spectacle. Infamy burns hot, but it never lasts. By the 1990s, the novelty of the Japanese cannibal had cooled. The talk shows moved on to fresher scandals. The publishers grew tired of repackaging the same grotesque story, and audiences who once leaned forward in morbid fascination now rolled their eyes at the familiar act. Issei Sagawa, however, had no other act. He was a man defined by a single event. And when the spotlight dimmed, he was left with nothing but himself. The money dried up, book royalties dwindled, porn appearances paid little, and the talk show circuit stopped calling. He tried odd jobs, cartooning, writing essays, peddling his own story in ever more desperate ways. But he had no real skills beyond his notoriety. Fame had been his income, and when fame faded, so did his stability. Physically, the frailty that had marked his birth began to catch up with him. He suffered a series of strokes that left him partially paralyzed, confined to a wheelchair. His once carefully cultivated persona, the soft-spoken, almost dandyish intellectual who could describe horror with eerie calm, shrank into the body of an invalid. Eating became difficult. Speaking too. For a man who had once defined himself by the consumption, the irony was bitter. He could barely swallow food at all. By the 2000s, Sagawa was living on the margins. His brother became his primary caretaker, pushing his wheelchair, managing his needs. Gone were the cameras, the books, the sordid allure. What remained was a man as fragile as the day he was born, trapped once again in the small, broken body that had haunted him his entire life. And yet, he never recanted. In interviews well into his later years, he still described the murder without remorse. He admitted that his appetite had never left him, even as his body failed. "I still fantasize about it," he confessed. It wasn't repentance he offered the world, but a kind of final provocation, a reminder that the hunger never ended, even if the man himself had been reduced to weakness and decay. On November 24th, 2022, Issei Sagawa died of pneumonia in Tokyo. He was 73. His death was quiet, his funeral small. No trial had ever been held, no sentence ever served. He passed not as a convict, but as a free man, one who had spent decades profiting from, and then rotting under, the weight of his own notoriety. For René Harteveldt's family, his death closed nothing. The imbalance remained. Their daughter, brilliant and generous, gone forever. Her killer, unpunished, allowed to live out a long life. Sagawa's afterlife was not one of redemption. It was the slow withering of a man who had once shocked the world, who turned murder into spectacle, and who died as he had lived. Frail, pitiful, and grotesquely unforgettable. The story of Issei Sagawa refuses to fade, not because it teaches us anything noble, but because it exposes everything rotten at the intersection of crime, media, and society. It is a case that lingers like a bad taste, morbid, absurd, grotesque, and still, people cannot look away. For France, the name is a reminder of legal failure, a confessed killer and cannibal who never faced a jury, never received a sentence, and instead slipped through the cracks of psychiatry and diplomacy. For René Harteveldt's family, it is the unbearable truth that justice was never delivered. Their daughter's life was reduced to headlines, her dignity undermined by the man who consumed her, and the systems that failed to contain him. For Japan, Sagawa became something stranger still, a mirror of media obsession. He was interviewed, published, photographed, filmed. He was invited into the studios not as a pariah, but as a curiosity. Frail, polite, smiling faintly as he described horrors in the same tone others might use to discuss literature. He became a walking contradiction. Too weak to be feared, too infamous to be ignored. And for the world, he became an urban legend in flesh. The cannibal of Paris. The tiny man with a grotesque appetite. His story is retold not because it offers meaning, but because it shocks. It sits uncomfortably at the edge of true crime and spectacle, feeding the same hunger that made him famous. The appetite to consume what should never be consumed. Decades later, his case still sparks outrage, disbelief, and morbid fascination. Documentaries are made, books reprinted, articles recycled. The same questions are asked. How could this happen? How could he walk free? Why did society give him the stage he craved? There are no satisfying answers, only the cold fact that he lived a full life, while Renee's ended at 25. He sold his crime as story, while her story was stolen outright. He became infamous, while she became footnote. In the end, Sagawa's legacy is nothing more than the echo of injustice. He stands as a symbol of loopholes exploited, of spectacle rewarded, of a system that let cruelty slip through its fingers. Paris still sells itself as the city of love. Postcards still sparkle with the Eiffel Tower, lovers still kiss on the Pont Neuf, but somewhere beneath that glitter, the name Issei Sagawa reminds us that even the most romantic of stages can be stained, and that some horrors, once told, can never be untold. And that, Sleepless Rabble, is the story of Issei Sagawa, the frail little man who turned Paris into something darker than any postcard could ever admit. A case so absurd it reads like fiction, except every word of it happened. If you made it this far, you know what to do. Hit that like button, subscribe for more late night horrors disguised as bedtime stories, and drop me a comment below. Which story do you want me to unravel next? This is Napmax Sleep Stories. And you've just listened to The Cannibal of Paris, the man who ate and became famous. Sweet dreams, if you can manage them.